It's a very great pleasure to host this event together with the Latvian Council of Science. Thank you, Laura. And also the State Education and Development Agency, and also Riga Technical University as our technical partner. As I already mentioned in the email, we're holding this event in English because we have Gavin Costigan joining us from the UK, and also some participants from the European Commission. Yeah, so this event will be recorded. It is currently already being recorded. If there are no technical difficulties, then it will be made into a guest podcast for the new Latvian Council of Science podcast, Zinātnes Zīmes. So keep this in mind if you ask any questions in person, that you will be recorded. So quickly about the format. So I will do a quick introduction, and then there will be a short presentation by Valts Kalniņš about a study that he recently did for us and for the JRC. And then we will have 4 short interventions, maybe between 5 and 8 minutes, where the panelists will be asked to briefly intervene. And then the rest of the event will be for questions and answers. And maybe 5 minutes before the end of the event, Steen from the Joint Research Center at the European Commission asked if he could give a quick update on JRC activities. So about the background, what is the background for why we're having this event? So we, as the Science and Education Ministry, we fund a lot of research. And of course, we want the research that we fund to have as much impact as possible. And everyone probably knows that our research and innovation system is quite underfunded in Latvia. But in order to be able to justify asking for more public investments in research, we need to be able to demonstrate that we're adding value to the economy, to society, and also to policymakers. So while it is our job as a ministry to do this on the system level, to demonstrate value of the system, it's up to the researchers to do this on the project level. And within the realm of research impacts, so I previously mentioned that we care about societal impact and economic impact and policy impact. This specific impact that's related to policy, whether it's on the local level, the national level, the international level, whether the policymakers are civil servants, ministers, or MPs. This is especially important for social sciences and humanities because this is one of the primary impacts that we expect from our social science research. Also, as policymakers ourselves in the ministry, we want policy to be made based on the best available evidence and expertise. And one example of how we're doing this is we're currently developing some policies in this new policy domain of open science. And there are several activities that we've done as a ministry to engage with the academic community to create policies in this area. So if later there are some questions about this, then feel free to ask them also to me. As for the perspective of the researcher, we see that there's a large divergence between researchers who are very good at producing policy relevant research and have a very holistic view of engaging with policymakers to actually drive policy change with their expertise and their findings. And then there's a large proportion of researchers who simply publish an article, organize a conference, write some policy recommendations, and then see this as sort of the end goal of their work and don't actively try to do anything with it. So our goal is to move more researchers into this first category. So I would like to now ask Valts Kalniņš, who is an assistant professor at the University of Latvia and an independent consultant on corruption and public ethics for various organizations, including the OECD, to take the floor. So a little bit of background why Valts is involved in this. So in 2019, with the support of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, we organized a conference in the Latvian Saima on demography and aging. And as part of this event, the JRC funded a study which Valts conducted to look at both the supply and demand sides of the use of scientific evidence in the Latvian Parliament. And Valts will now present the main findings of the study. And more specifically, I asked him to focus on those aspects that are most relevant for researchers, because most of the people joining this webinar today are researchers. I especially encourage researchers to make note of the access points to the Latvian Parliament, which I hope Valts will also point out. So please, Valts.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have this chance to present very, very briefly some of the findings and the observations that could be made based on the study on the use of research-based evidence, which we carried out last year, and which focused specifically on the issue areas of demography and migration. But I do believe that some of these observations are valid beyond that. And the key focus of the study was the supply and demand of research-based evidence in decision making in the Latvian Parliament, in the Saima. I carried out a number of interviews with researchers and members of Parliament, and a few of the observations that I would like to mention are the following. For one thing, I think what comes out quite clearly from the study is that actually the success and the intensity of the use of research-based evidence largely depends on the institutionalization of this area of interaction, because we see that the most consistent interaction between researchers and members of Parliament has taken place where there are dedicated institutional formats, both actually in the Saima and also on the part of the research community. Thus, when we look at the Saima, most consistently researchers communicate with decision makers, where you have a dedicated subcommittee, for example. If there is a subcommittee in the Parliament which is dedicated to a certain field of policy, then it is almost guaranteed, and we show it statistically, that quite often researchers will either be invited to join the committee meetings, or some of the researchers will themselves ask to be invited and offer certain expertise. The same goes for situations where the Parliament creates working groups for certain issue areas. In this study, one of the issue areas that we focused on was the elaboration of the diaspora law, for example. And when there is an institutional format, a working group, then it is, of course, the most one of the deepest levels of engagement when a researcher becomes a participant in a parliamentary working group, for example. On the side of the research community, we have to say that actually a permanent supply or ongoing supply of research findings for members of Parliament also depends in a way on institutionalization. And when you have units like which act like think tanks, then basically people who work for such think tanks, and those can be like independent organizations, or those can be units within, let's say, the university. Then people who work there will be more likely to devote a certain time and effort on a continuous basis to trying to inform decision makers. So institutionalization on the sides of demand side and supply side, I think is one key factor. But of course, it's not the only one. We see a certain model in relations with the executive, which is based on maybe on different grounds. And the executive in Latvia basically supplies itself with research findings and recommendations, rather much based on procuring research. So they simply purchase research, which is and often it is individual researchers who bid for those competitions and get paid for carrying out policy relevant research. I don't know if it would be such a key recommendation for the Parliament to start extensively buy outside research, procure, maybe to some extent, but I'm not sure if that is the only way. But I think it would be quite important to see if it is possible to develop new regular procedures of exchange between members of Parliament and researchers. I could imagine, for example, programs or permanent consultation arrangements whereby the Parliament invites and calls for outside expertise on a regular basis with regard to specific issues. You know, some kind of permanent MP researcher or MP scientist consultation mechanism or something like that. When such, and that's the case when if you create such opportunities, there will be people who will be interested in using them, in supplying knowledge for members of Parliament in such situations. It could also be perhaps certain other means, and of course you could say that there's a whole lot of tools that researchers use and could use more extensively to make sure that their research is more useful and user-friendly for the needs of members of Parliament, and of course also for the needs of policymakers in other branches of power as well. For example, a common issue that I discussed with members of Parliament and also with some of the researchers was how elaborate actually and how user-friendly the recommendations that researchers prepare are, and there were actually wishes from all sides that the work on preparing and disseminating research recommendations was perhaps more focused on the needs of members of Parliament and so on. So probably more developed guidelines for how policy relevant research should be prepared, and not prepared. Well, researchers know how to prepare research, but how to present research, that depends on very much on the individual. So such guidelines like that could actually be helpful too. And so I would say that and I'll stop here probably. One of the very general conclusions is that the steps should be oriented, focused on moving from the level where the interaction depends on the individual enthusiasm and initiative of this or that member of Parliament individually, or this or that researcher individually, to a more permanent and systematic interaction. Well, of course, we could speak about those details a lot in many different forms, how it could be done, but I think I'll stop here with my very brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Valts. I think during the questions and answers session, we can touch on this question about the role of think tanks, and also about this idea for a call for expertise in the Parliament. Okay, now I would like to introduce Arnis Sauka, who is a professor and the director of the Center for Sustainable Business at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, and a founding member of the IFM Research Fellow Network. Just last Wednesday, one of Arnis's major projects, the Shadow Economy Index, was presented in the SSC Riga auditorium. And I don't think there are so many researchers in Latvia who year after year fill their whole lecture room with so many ministers and heads of public and private institutions. But of course, Arnis is also involved in many other high impact activities, and he also has very good visibility on the main pain points for communicating evidence to policymakers overall. So please, Arnis.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Great. Thank you for inviting me to join such a nice audience of scholars, and I was briefly asked to sort of share my experience in how to communicate with the policymakers and with the industry, and certainly I do have some experience into this, but I'm also very much looking forward to sort of different other opinions, because it's really never-ending process. Once you started, then probably it never stops, hopefully. Well, what I know from my experience, and these are not my words, and I cannot also quote a particular person, but I've heard in one of the conferences I attended from the keynote speaker that there is one single very important reason why it is very difficult to cooperate between academics, industry, and the policymakers, and the reason is that three of us have different sort of aims and different time frames. It might sound very simplistic, but in general, we researchers, we are interested in promotion, so that is our driver, the key driver. Whereas when it comes to the time frame, we have all time in the world to do the research. Policymakers are mostly interested in power, and they operate in 4 or 5 election time period. Entrepreneurs are mostly, not only, but mostly interested in money, and they need everything like yesterday, right? So even if our interests match, so the clock mechanism works in a different speed, and thus it's very difficult to cooperate unless there is a moderation or some sort of institutional support or whatever kind of means of promoting this cooperation. So it is indeed quite challenging to do this work, and it's not always easy, but it's certainly fun if you ask me. And regardless of the challenges, of course, it is possible. So let me just share some of the tips, suggestions, something that I would suggest myself to consider when working with the industry and the policymakers. The first thing is certainly that scholars, we should be experts in the area of our research. And by expertise, I mean really involvement in fundamental academic research that should be also hopefully demonstrated by top-level academic publications in top academic journals. Reason is quite simple. If we lack fundamental research and these publications of expertise, then this applied research is quite likely to be rather weak, as we would simply lack in-depth expertise in the area. We could be limited with the methodologies that we can apply. We could be limited in many other sort of issues, and that could influence the quality of the advice that we give. And I think this should be kept in mind in the context of this pressure that we have usually from the industry, that sometimes also policymakers sort of require us that whatever we do should be directly applicable for the policy in industry purposes. So what I'm saying, and my experience suggests, is that if you don't have this fundamental knowledge, then this suggestion, the policy suggestion, might also come as weak. And well, at least my experience also shows that this academic expertise very much complements the applied research. And for instance, the shadow economy index research that was already mentioned, basically my interest in this area started from the industry. I was back before I entered my academic life, I was working in the private sector, and I was responsible for governmental tenders, trying to sell different types of equipment. And I saw corruption myself working when in the industry. So that triggered my interest to the extent that I entered the PhD studies, and then I wrote. I spent time in UK, spent time in Sweden. I finished my PhD in Germany, and I wrote a doctoral dissertation on productive and productive destructive entrepreneurship, and drawing on this sort of academic research, we created this shadow economy index, which was initially a sort of applied type of research. Then we published academic papers. Then we established the conference that was already mentioned. We involved in different types of discussions with the policymakers. From these discussions, many interesting ideas emerged that turned out, in some cases, in top quality journal publications. And so we are sort of going back and forth from academia to the industry. Again, the shadow economy research has also some applied spillovers, such as we conduct study on illegal share of the TV services, some paid TV services. We have applied research in shadow economy and construction industry, and several other examples, but also we have some academic publications out of each of those activities. Then the second tip would be, very shortly put, reputation and independence. It is quite often that it is not what you say as being academician or whoever, but it is about the messenger. And I think that you can lose your reputation only really once, and independence is really key. So my suggestion is to be in close cooperation with the policymakers, but remember, it's not really a friendship. It's rather tough love that we are offering, if I may say so. And really, we should be ready to criticize our cooperation partners in a constructive manner, hopefully, and also receive criticism about methods that we apply. And also, not all money is worth to take when you cooperate with the industry. So you should also follow ethics. Sometimes industry, when they pay, they think that they can order what they want, but it's not really this type of product that we are offering. Again, it comes back to the reputation. The third thing, which is I think is very important when it comes to communicating the product, the academic product that we create, is ability to create platforms, if I can say so. It is different to start all this to get attention, but it's also very difficult, challenging to maintain this reputation over the years. And it's really not that policymakers or industry are sitting and waiting and looking what the researchers do and what we can take from this. You should be really proactive to communicate your product, your message. And it's not always easy. And one way of doing this is really to identify which are the potential actors that could be interested in your research, and which could be this sort of type of platform through which you could easier or better targeted communicate the research findings. For instance, for the shadow economy index, we have created a platform that draws on the cooperation between the Latvian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Ministry of Finance, and this is the Shadow Economy Annual Conference that we organize. It has been 10th conference that we held last week, and this attracts lots of media attention and lots of sort of the policy debate that again quite often leads to fundamental research. Another example is involvement in so-called fiscal sentiment index. This is the cooperation between the SSE Riga and Foreign Investors Council in Latvia, where we do study on the sentiment of foreign investors, how they see environment in Latvia for investment. And here we have also created annual fiscal sentiment index conference, and also these findings are widely communicated with the media. Yet another example is the shadow economy study in construction industry, which we have also done for 5 consecutive years, and this is also in the cooperation with the major industry association that we teamed up doing, and they are also funding this study. So different types of platforms could help to disseminate your message. The fourth tip, if I may say so, is really learning how to communicate with different target groups. With media, with the policymakers, with entrepreneurs, we have to communicate differently than we are used to in the conferences, right? So this is very important issue, and you know, I think we could have some courses for or some training for the researchers on how this could be done. That would be helpful. And the final tip is something that Valts already mentioned: institutional level support. That is, you know, if it is available, it's really good. And indeed, if deans, vice rectors, or rectors are listening to this webinar, I think that my key suggestion or hope would be that they would more involve in moderating and motivating academic researchers to involve in applied research, right? Well, I think that first thing to do would be really hiring people in the faculties that could help researchers to reach policymakers and industries of the moderators, bringing in this moderating expertise to bridge the gap between the interests and the timeframes of researchers, policymakers, and the industry. And I think also if universities are indeed interested that their scholars, academicians are involved in applied research, they should also somehow appreciate this involvement in applied research when it comes to promotion to those academicians, to professors. This time should be paid. Of course, you should understand that, like in entrepreneurship and business, sometimes it works, sometimes it does not work. You should take risks in order to help to fund studies. So this type of help would be very, very essential. This institutional support would be very important. And finally, and most importantly, I think, is that at least me, and I think also other researchers that are here, I think we prefer waking up in the morning, regardless of whether it's about academic or fundamental research or applied research. We prefer to wake up in the morning knowing that, you know, this is something that we want to do. This is our thing, our intention. Not that the dean wants, or rector wants, or Ministry of Education wants, but this is us. And I think when we come to this, and when we have a good enough environment, then also the result is not so long to wait. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Lots of interesting things there. I think also, speaking of these platforms for engaging with policymakers, Gavin is also heading one of these platforms, so he will also share some experiences. Okay, next I would like to welcome Ivars Ijabs. He's a well-known political scientist and longtime academic at the University of Latvia. Since 2019, he's a member of the European Parliament, representing the liberal Renew Europe political group. And Ivars serves on the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, and is actively involved with both the Horizon Europe program and also the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, so EIT. And Ivars has a very unique perspective because he has successfully undergone a transition from academia to politics. So he has many insights from this, but he's also familiar with the engagement points for researchers to engage with the European Parliament specifically, some of which he may mention. So please, Ivars.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you hear me? Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. Alexander's already said my kind of double identity in this particular context. And of course, at the very beginning, I have to mention that when I came to the European Parliament, I was pleasantly surprised because of the research infrastructure and of the research staff, which is quite extensive over there. Basically, there are three entities in the European Parliament which are dealing with research in a very profound manner. The first one is, of course, the European Parliament Research Service, which is providing MEPs with a lot of relevant information in a very understandable and readable form, which is very important. The second one is, of course, the policy department, which more or less works with different kinds of policy issues. And the third is a panel of the future of science and technology, where I have the honor to be the vice chair. This is basically something like a committee on the role of science and technology in the future of Europe. But, well, if you look at the whole context, we are talking about the relations between researchers and policymakers. First of all, of course, we have to understand, just as Arnis said before me, this is about two different time frames, and not just about time frames. This is very much also about the approach to knowledge, because, well, researchers, they are very often involved with testing their hypotheses, and that's why this is a never-ending debate, never-ending discussion, and so on and so forth. Policymakers, especially politicians, have to take the decision, which is basically coming out of their own conviction, out of their own will. This is an old story about the two elements of political decision-making coming from the Roman Empire, when they said this is about voluntas, about the will, and also about the ratio. And of course, the researchers and science in general represents the second moment, which not always prevails when political decisions are taken. Looking to the Latvian context, which I'm more or less aware of course, this was mentioned already by both speakers before me, who said that basically the impact of research on the policy making depends very much on the quality and funding of the research itself in a particular country. And of course, if we really want an evidence-based policy making in Latvia, of course, we have to think about the general research infrastructure we are having here, also in terms of internationalization, of peer-reviewed publications, and different kinds of criteria which might prove the quality of what those researchers are doing. But if you look at the very process, which I'm looking forward very much to read in Valt's research paper, as far as I understand, he has worked on it in the collaboration with the Joint Research Center, which is also a very important research institution in the European Union, belonging to the European Commission. And actually, if COVID wasn't there, I was willing to go to Ispra, where this institute is located, because of my professional duties as a vice chair of the STOA panel. But nevertheless, I'm looking forward to read this particular paper. Of course, I'm looking at the relations between politicians and researchers here in Latvia, what we might observe is, first of all, politicians are, of course, interested in research, in different kinds of data which might provide them with clues and with arguments for their own political activity. But at the same time, they are also sometimes a little bit suspicious, if you want, because of they are being afraid of biased research. And this is a purely Latvian thing, that basically, since our politicians, especially the MPs, are not provided with enough of information of their own, they very often depend on the information provided by different kinds of lobbyists. And those lobbyists are being paid, and they are being supported by different kinds of interests, without any doubt. And this is why politicians tend to be rather suspicious of a certain kind of research coming from outside. Of course, there is a newly created, well, I think it's working something like 4 or 5 years, this kind of in-house research institution of the Latvian Saima, which is good. The initiative is good, and I think that, well, this was also to my mind, largely influenced by a very strong opinion of a colleague of mine and a colleague of Valts, Arnis Sauka, who was supporting the idea that the Latvian parliament should at last have its own research institution. But as we probably see, the output of this, how it's called, the research service or whatever, is not so impressive. Also in terms of funding, because, well, there are very few, as to my knowledge, full-time researchers employed by that particular institution. And from the point of view of researchers themselves, this is, just as Arnis mentioned, the issue of neutrality. Because since science is, and research in itself is underfunded, heavily underfunded here in Latvia, those researchers are very often inclined to, well, to serve a certain political interest, coming to a certain politician asking, what kind of conclusions do you want? What is the conclusion we should provide you with? So, and this is a situation we shouldn't accept, actually, because if we really need a professional and evidence-based research, you shouldn't be, let's say, guaranteed a certain amount of political neutrality, not jumping to conclusions that have already been supported by your donor, if you want. So in that sense, of course, well, I think that there is quite a long way to go in order to make the Latvian policy making more or less research-based and evidence-based. But nevertheless, I think that especially with the establishment of the research service in the parliament itself, and with, let's say, certain generational change taking place among our politicians, I'm pretty hopeful that we will go on and continue in improving this interface between politics and research. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And in the Q&A, if people are interested, we can further discuss this question about trust and also neutrality. Okay, now there will be another researcher, Signe Mežinska, who will also approach this from the practitioner's perspective. She is an associate professor at the University of Latvia, Faculty of Medicine. She's a researcher in biomedical research ethics and biobanking, and also an expert for BBMRI, and vice chair of the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee. She's involved in many activities on the national level, including the development of the new biobank law. So please, Signe.
Hello, thank you for inviting me, and I think this is a very important discussion because of several reasons, and maybe the first thing I will echo from previous speakers is the importance of fundamental research and importance of research funding in Latvia, because before I listened to the previous speakers, that was my first thing I wanted to emphasize. Why? Because if we think about policy making, not only in national, but also in international level, how we can be involved in policy making in international level, especially, and that's possible only based on our research work done before, and in many ways it's based also on fundamental research, because I'm involved in UNESCO International Bioethics Committee, which is really a big player in international policy making. That's the committee which in 2005 issued a Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. And experts are invited to take part in this committee based on their personal expertise, and only if our researchers will have enough funding to demonstrate their research, in many cases fundamental research, they might be invited to such international bodies. So funding is crucial, I would say, and we should not expect applied research in all cases. Not all research should be applied. Of course, it's very good if we can demonstrate how research can be applied to policy contexts, but we need also fundamental and theoretical research. If we speak about communication with policymakers, I would like to be very positive in many senses, because my experience in Latvia in last 10 years, let's say, is very positive. I'm working mainly in the field of health, and I can say that both Ministry of Health and also parliamentarian commissions are very open and also in many situations proactive in communication with scientists. Of course, it should be both sides, both scientists and policymakers should be very proactive, but as I said, my experience is quite positive. And there was a question I saw about lobbyists and scientists, and who is more listened by policymakers. I can say that in my experience in health field, where of course industry is very powerful, pharmaceutical industry, for example, the changes I have observed in last 10 years are enormous, and there are very good signs that scientists are really listened to, and sometimes much more than industry stakeholders. But one thing which was not mentioned so far by previous speakers, I think, is the very big role NGOs are playing in policy making process and in the connection of scientists and policymakers. And I think we should somehow empower also this collaboration, because my best experience in influencing policymakers is in collaboration with NGOs. I think NGOs have very often they have a big experience in translating research results to the language which is understandable for policymakers. They are sometimes very good in making research results shorter and translating them into lay language. And yeah, and I think it's very helpful, and maybe our research institutions should even more think how to collaborate with NGOs. And NGOs are very helpful, I think, also in including as many stakeholders as possible in policy making process and discussions, because especially in health field, we cannot imagine discussion of scientific results and policy making without involving patient organizations nowadays. Of course, also industry should be involved in certain role, and many other stakeholders. So I see very often NGOs as this meeting point where all these stakeholders can come together and exchange viewpoints and somehow encourage communication with policy makers. Yeah. So I think I will be short, because as I see, we are running out of time.
We're running a little bit behind schedule. I think we will continue 5 minutes past, and then we will end. Okay, so now our final speaker, I would like to welcome Gavin Costigan. He's the Chief Executive of the Foundation for Science and Technology in the UK, and formerly a Director of Public Policy Southampton. which is a unit within the University of Southampton helping researchers get policy impact for their research and connecting them to policymakers. And Gavin was also the inaugural chair of the UK's University Policy Engagement Network, UPEN. So please, Gavin.
Well, thanks, Alex, and thank you for inviting me to this event. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK. And the first thing to say is there have always been individual examples of academics bringing their expertise and evidence to policymakers. But what's happened in the last 15 years or so is an increase in the way that that's been systematized and that processes have been put in place to try and increase the amount of that activity. Rather like we heard from Valts, activities has happened on both the demand side and on the supply side. So looking at the UK government, around about 15 years ago, the UK government introduced a network of chief scientific advisors into each of the UK government departments. And obviously the main role of those people is to make sure that the policy decisions that are taken in those departments take account of the right science and evidence. But an element of that role is to actually go out and look for that evidence and try and make links with the academic community so that that evidence is pulled in. And many different government departments have scientific advisory committees of one sort or another, and there are some government-wide scientific advisory committees. Just at the moment in the UK, we hear all the time about the work of SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, who are helping the government think about the evidence needed to take decisions on the coronavirus, for example. One thing that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is that those same government departments have started publishing documents that they call areas of research interest, that actually set out the questions that they would like to have answered and the areas that they would like more evidence on. And that's a great signal for the academic community about where they could engage and have a receptive audience on the other side. And the other thing government has done a lot of in the last 3 or 4 years is to increase the amount of social media it puts out to advertise consultations and advertise calls for evidence that it has. And moving from government to Parliament, again, for many years, the UK Parliament has had an office called the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, with the acronym POST. And they do a number of things, but one of the things they do is to second PhD students to work in Parliament for 3 months to produce a peer-reviewed document that sets out the state of knowledge in a particular field that is of use to parliamentarians going forwards. And it could be a technological issue, for example, facial recognition, or it could be a more social science issue, or it could be a more environmental science issue. But the point is that it's rigorous and it's peer reviewed, but the process of bringing in a PhD student also opens up a potential future academic to the world in which parliamentarians work. And Parliament has also worked very hard at increasing the number of academics who appear before committees. And again, committees was mentioned earlier by Valts, but we've tended to find until fairly recently that it's the same academics being called again and again to committees. And actually, the UK Parliament wants to have a wider range of people with a more diverse set of views appearing before it. So again, it's put in place activities to train academics about how committees work, to use social media to advertise the different opportunities and so on. So that, if you like, is the demand side. On the supply side, UK universities have been dangled 2 big incentives to do more work in the public policy area. And it's worth briefly stepping out and saying how research is funded in the UK. Public funding for research comes in 2 big chunks. One of them is forward-looking grant funding. So in the way that you'd expect, you apply for a grant to do research. If you are the best application, you get the money and you go and do the research. But every single grant now has to have a statement about how you could get impact from that research. And as Alex was saying at the beginning, that's wider than just, impact is wider than just public policy, but there is an element now of people putting in their grant proposals, this is how we are going to get some policy impact from our research. And you can get funding in the grants to actually go and do that. And that might buy you train tickets to the Parliament or whatever it happens to be. The other way that funding is, for research is done in the UK is looking back. Every 7 years, there's an exercise that says how good was the research in this university, in this discipline, and depending on how well you do, depends on how much money you're given for the next 7 years. And what's changed is that now 25% of that money is being given on the basis of how good was the impact of the research, not how good was the research itself. And so there are now these two quite major financial incentives for UK universities to work harder at impact, and within impact to work harder at public policy. And as I said, there have been academics working on policy for years, but what there haven't been is structures. And many UK universities in the last 5 or 6 years have been putting in place professional teams to support this kind of work. They do a number of different things, but in essence, they help train up academics in the ways, the mysterious ways that government and parliament work, and bring those academics with their evidence and expertise to parliament and government, but they also go into parliament and government, find out what's wanted and bring those opportunities back. And there's a new role effectively emerging in UK universities of policy brokers. And in fact, there's a new role emerging in government departments of policy brokers, and the policy brokers are speaking to each other to help this process of bringing evidence and expertise from where it is to where it's needed. And in fact, as Alex mentioned in his kind introduction, there's been a network of these policy units within UK universities joining together, partly to learn from each other, because this is a very new activity. We need to identify best practice, but also partly to have a bigger representation. So if you go as an individual university to a government department and say, my university's great, we've got some expertise, they have a certain level of interest. But if you go and you say, I represent 60 UK universities, that has a much bigger impact. And this network has grown from being just a dozen or so when it was set up a year and a half ago to being more than 50 now. So that shows you the level of demand. And in effect, a new profession is being developed in the UK at the moment, this profession of policy brokering. And it's happening both on the supply side and on the demand side. And it's very new. But if you think of the way that universities were maybe 30 years ago in the way that they dealt with business, and the way that that's changed so that there are now professional support activities within universities, and indeed professional support things within businesses looking to work with universities, that's the direction of travel that we're seeing in the UK. I'll stop there. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much. So because we're running short on time, I will now open the floor for questions. Can you please press the raise hand, either mention on the chat that you would like to speak, or raise your hand, and then I will call on you, and then you can ask your question. Laura, do you see any? Oh, Walt?
Sorry, I'm not immediately sure how you raise hand in on this application. No, I just wanted to quickly react to a couple of comments that we have here, and they mentioned the keywords of lobbyists and what is the purpose of and whether evidence-based policy support could be a purpose of research activity. I think there's actually a worthy reason for discussion about the purpose, because at least from my interviews with policymakers, I risk oversimplification a little bit here, but I might summarize that they are not actually especially eager and enthusiastic about getting more lobbyists. they have enough lobbyists around them, the decision makers. And when it comes to typical kind of lobbying type of issues regarding values, regarding big strategies and so on, what to do in principle terms, policymakers often have their minds made up already. They are actually very much interested in researchers as consultants. I want to, raise the birth rate, or I want to do something else, and if there were a researcher who could come to me and tell me how to better do it, then I'd be happy as a politician. And I think it is actually therefore a very worthy reason for researchers. What is the role that the researchers themselves want to undertake? Do we want to be consultants, or do we want to be sort of lobbyists or advocates for wider social values, or for regarding wider strategic issues? And I think on the level of researchers, this is still very much an issue of individual choice. And I've talked to a number of researchers, and some are personally more motivated to engage on different policy and also value issues. And some are not so much. They are researchers, they they do scientific work and so on, and they're not really lobbyists. They don't have this urge to necessarily lobby for something. And so I think there's a lot of food for further deliberation on that point. What do researchers themselves, individually and as a community, want to do? And what role they want for themselves.
Thank you. Do any of the participants have any questions? Because there might be an issue with raising your hand. I think if you do, please just turn on your microphone now. And so if no one will do this, then I will read one of the questions from the chat. So Irene asks, could you name 3 main channels that you would advise to use in research projects to facilitate successful communication of the research findings to policymakers? So what would be the 3 main policy impact pathways? And for any of the panelists, you can answer this.
Well, if I may, I think that one of the most important things, and this is about the prestige and also about the relevance of scientific knowledge in general society. This is a question about the science media. Well, we have been doing something about in that direction, but there is still a lack of professional and devoted scientific communication to explain what this or that researcher is doing in a way that people really are interested to listen to it, because this is, of course, a communicational problem. I have been editing a few volumes of the most distinguished scientists of the University of Latvia, which were intended to provide their knowledge in a more or less comprehensible form also to the general public. And this was really a challenge. You really need special skills to do that. I mean, to provide, and in that sense, I think that this is very much an issue also of the science journalism. And that's why I was willing to advertise also one of my kind of pet projects in the European Parliament, which is the European Science Media Hub, which is the ESMH, a science media hub which provides all the member states and all the science journalists in all 27 member states with relevant information about the most acute, most interesting scientific research going on in European countries. So thank you very much.
If I may add, in my view, the most effective forms of communication are interactive, because by that I mean on-site presentation of research results by inviting all possible stakeholders, where they can ask questions, where they can discuss the results of science. Because of course it's very important to publish also in mass media, but it's always one direction communication, and then interpretation might be also sometimes with some problems or some mistakes. So the meeting where all stakeholders meet on site and have this possibility to ask and discuss, in my experience, are the most effective ones.
Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, I see 2 more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I think we definitely, several people either directly or just like Signe just now mentioned the role of platforms. This is one area we should focus on. And then I think we as a ministry at least should continue this discussion about how to institutionalize and support universities to support their researchers to promote their evidence to policymakers. Now we are officially, it's 3 o'clock, but I promised Stijn from the European Commission's Joint Research Center that he would have maybe 4 minutes to give a brief overview of what the JRC is doing, and also some of these will be engagement opportunities for researchers. So I suggest to everyone who has 3 more minutes or 4 more minutes, please stay. So please, Stijn.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'll be very brief, and I appreciate the opportunity to briefly take the floor. So I'm Stijn Verleyen, working at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. For those of you who don't know us, we are kind of the in-house science service of the European Commission, supporting policy proposals with scientific evidence in all phases of the policy cycle. Now, we do this mainly at Commission level, but since years we've also been reaching out to member states, regions, and even cities in Europe to strengthen across the European Union this culture of evidence in foreign policy making. And one of the projects we've been, one of the flagship projects of recent years was the Science Meets Parliaments project that Alex mentioned, and under which this study that was discussed today was financed. It was actually a project that was pushed by the ITRE committee and also the STOA panel, which were mentioned by Mr. Ijabs, a member of Parliament, earlier on today. So what we've been doing with this project is going to member states, to regions, and holding events on specific policy topics, inviting experts, possibly providing experts from our side. But we've also been financing studies, as in this case, and importantly, we've also organized trainings. I mean, I've heard a lot of interesting things about training scientists on how to package their message and how to deliver it to policymakers, and we're also doing that at JRC with our own scientists, but also we're delivering this training to external audiences more and more. But we're also looking at the other side, because we also think that policymakers need to be trained to spot what is good evidence, to distinguish good science from bad science, to see what is useful. So to give them some basic scientific literacy, this is something we've been working on with this project. This pilot project is now finishing, and just to finish my message, I want to say that we're working on a follow-up instrument or initiative to really try to assess this, I mean, to put this on a structural basis. And one of the things we're doing is a project called Strengthening and Connecting Science for Policy Systems in Europe, where we really try to bring together, we use the sort of convening power of the European Commission to try to create a community across Europe of these people who are working on evidence in foreign policy making. And I look forward to continuing the discussions, among others, with Latvia. And just as a final word, JRC is one of the biggest organizations and the biggest DGs in the Commission. We have a lot of researchers. There's opportunities for researchers to join the JRC on a contractual basis. There are also the so-called joint collaborative doctoral partnerships. And I invite you to discover the link of, discover the website of JRC to get more information on that. Just Google EU Science Hub and you'll have all the info. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stijn, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining.